All right, so this is something that came in from Melinda on event security planning, and I forget the exact question, but it was along the lines of how do you plan for security within the event environment? It always feels so tacked on. So what I thought we'd do is put together a quick presentation because we've got a framework built around it, and it's not too hard to sort of go through that framework. But I think the first thing to understand with security is a lot of people treat security as a line item for events, and what they're really looking to do is essentially just hand off the whole engagement. So they allocate a budget and they think, okay, great, I can just find a security company and they will manage it for me. And they really are just treating it as another box ticking exercise in the delivery of the event. And what concerns me a lot of the time is that outside of that contractor supplied security plan is that there is no security plan from the event management company. They don't actually have a plan of how they're going to work with the security company, manage the engagement of that security company, and ensure that that security company is doing the things they need the security provider to do to make the event safe and secure. The next thing that we really look to is security and crowd management get combined into one discipline, and they're not. They're two individual disciplines, and they require entirely different skills, different training, and different planning across different, often at times, contractors. And bundling them into the one brief and the wrong provider is often where a lot of planning goes wrong with events because, as I said, they're just two different disciplines. So you can't treat two different disciplines with the same rationale and the same processes. So what is security? Security is about threat assessment and response. So that is looking at what threats are around the site and how you will respond to that, whether it's a armed intruder threat or it's a risk from stage jumpers getting on stage. How will the security company manage those and respond to those? So the next thing is access control and asset protection. So who goes where, when, who's authorized to go in those places, and how are we protecting the assets of the event? And a great example of this is I can't remember how many concerts I've done over the years where people have climbed delay towers and stood on top of delay towers in front of the stage and danced on top of them. That is a great example of asset protection. Now, somebody climbing that asset is not only a risk to themselves, it's a risk to all the people around them, and it's a risk to the show. I've actually had to do show stops where it has got so crazy, we've had to stop the show and get people pulled down off towers. And if they refuse to come down, it's very hard to get those people down. It's a height recovery process. The other one that was always baffled me was people would climb on top of the big top circus tents at festivals and dance on top of them. I mean, it did look like fun, but so what are your assets? What's the risk to those assets? And in today's day and age, what is the risk to the overall event from those? Incident response and escalation. So how will security respond to incidents and how will they escalate it from there? And, what incident response teams are they going to have on the ground? Then we get to law enforcement liaison. And I might just put in here, I think we've missed one as well, which is about licensing and, your licensing requirements for alcohol as well, making sure all that's kept in order. But law enforcement liaison, so security will work with law enforcement to ensure that that relationship is managed between the two organisations, because security can only go so far until law enforcement needs to step in. So essentially, security is what you are protecting against. What is crowd management? And this is, again, something I don't think a lot of event professionals quite understand enough detail about what is crowd management, because they just confuse crowd management with security and think they're interchangeable. So crowd management is essentially the movement, density, flow, comfort and behaviour of the people at the event. So how do they experience that space? How do they move around the space? How do you keep that experience safe and comfortable? People don't panic unless there's a reason to panic. And the reason people panic is generally overcrowding. So if people don't feel comfortable and they don't feel safe, they will start to panic. So crowd management is really about how people are going to move around the event and what you're defending against. A static guard on a gate is not a crowd manager, but at the same point in time, a steward managing a queue should not be treated as security. They're managing that queue and that access. So, if you've got somebody checking bags at the front gate, that's a security job. Yes, maybe they can be deployed later in the day for a crowd management role, but you need to make sure that's an independent deployment and that person is rebriefed when they change that position to understand that they're not acting anymore in a security capacity. They're now acting in a crowd management capacity. So the framework I promised at the start. Phase 1 is scope and design. Steps 1 to 5 is where we do the thinking work, where we do the planning, understand the site plan, where the access controls are, why we're doing what we need to do, and where are we doing it. So this is really the planning processes. Then phase 2 is your procurement and your delivery phase, which is steps 6 to 12, which become the execution. Who does it? How do we brief them? And how do we manage them? Finish the thinking in phase 1 before you start the buying. And this is where a lot of people go wrong. They start buying before they do the thinking, and they think they can do the thinking as part of the process. But the reality is, if you haven't done the thinking, you're not in a position to do the purchasing. And that goes with anything. So the framework. And step 1, review the event and the client history. Understand what it is you're walking into. What is your client's risk appetite? What incidents have occurred before on the site or at similar events? What did the debrief from last time say? Dive into the history, because history informs design. And if you're working with historical data, which isn't always possible, but if you do have it, if you've got historical data and you work with it, you're going to end up with a better site design. If you skip this step, your site analysis and your risk assessment are both going to be weaker documents. Next, site design and analysis. So we covered this off a bit in the first one, talking about the history. Now we're going to do the site design and analysis. Where are your access control points? Where are the people entering from? How are you controlling it? Where are you doing search and screening work? What is the vehicle entry process, and how are pedestrians entering the event? Making sure you understand how you're going to separate public from operational areas. So this breaks down all of things like your perimeter integrity, fence lines, barrier placement, blind spots, points of vulnerability, secure zones, your backstage, VIPs, cash handling, artist areas, production compounds, who has access and how is it managed, and what resources are you working with. So where is your CCTV and your lighting coverage? Where are the dark spots and where are the gaps? And finally, your command and control positioning. So where does your security and your operations sit? And can they see what they need to see? And can they reach who they need to reach? So thinking about your communications, what are communications backup? And while we're here, I will just say that WhatsApp is not a communication tool for event command and control. So WhatsApp is a great tool to keep everybody updated if a set time's changed or if, the VIP has reached capacity, maybe. But it is not a command and control tool. People have black spots, they take too long to type, they drop out, it's not. Step 3, risk assessment. And this is one of the most important things that to do as part of the planning process. Now, if you're not qualified in doing a security risk assessment, work with somebody who is. So make sure it is a security specific risk assessment and just not a general risk matrix. You're talking about threat assessments and crowd profiles, time of day, whether the event is licensed or unlicensed, and what's the worst possible scenarios and what does your response to those look like. So a family day in a park and a licensed music event that finish at midnight are two entirely different jobs with two entirely different risk processes. But unfortunately, a lot of people treat them very similarly, and we'll get to that a bit later on. Step 4 is allocate the budget. And some of our budget traps, especially when we're talking security, is overspending, because people don't go through the design and consultation process first. You end up overspending. You end up with more security than you thought you were going to need. You might need more barriers because you brought the security company on and they've gone, well, there's not enough barriers for us to do our job properly. But if your security team can't work with the event space, then there's no point having them there, right? Think of this as a cost coordination process, and make sure you've got the resources planned for the security deployment that you're going to end up with. And that leads us to allocating resources. So this is where we staff to the risk and not the shift. So 10 guards for a show and 10 guards for a bump out is not how you should plan. Your risk profile will change day by day and throughout the day. So you need to make sure you've got a dynamic risk profile that allocates the security resources at the time of day you need them. And before I mentioned having bag checkers deployed into crowd management, that's a great process of how to use those resources effectively, because you don't need all your bag checkers after a few hours on the gate. Most of your crowd are inside. Now you need more crowd management people. Again, just make sure you rebrief them. But there's other resources you need to also think about. Think about CCTV, whether you're going to have drones, dogs, horses, motorbikes, buggies. They all cost money, and significant amounts of money at that. Next, security management. And this is a very important operational process to understand. Security management is the critical layer of the overall security process. So a good supervisor will compensate for a lot of bad bodies on the ground. When we look at security, we break security down between management and personnel. And generally, personnel will come from a whole raft of different places. They will come from, labour hire pools that are shared by many different security companies. But the security supervisor is the brains of the outfit. He is the person that drives the personnel to do the best job they can do on the day. So if you don't have good security management in place, it doesn't matter what security personnel provider you have, they're going to be next to useless. And make sure you've got a good chain of command in that process as well as you set up your security management. Next, develop your scope of works. Understand what the roles and responsibility is, what the reporting lines are, who's got authority to escalate different things within the event. And you want to make sure that your scope of works doesn't just say, I need 20 guards from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m, because that's not really a scope of works. That's just something you'd put on a purchase order. And here we talked about contractors before. Now you should be allocating the contractor. Once you've done all this other stuff, we're talking about now allocating a contractor. Contractors, it's important to understand that most contractors have really thin margins and high turnover. They subcontract the majority of their security personnel. There are very few security companies in the world that will have enough personnel to fill a job, especially when you get to big events. So think of a concert or a music festival where you need 400 to 600 guards. It is unlikely that a lot of security companies will have that number of guards on their roster to be able to fill with all the other work they've got going on. So they're going to subcontract that, and they all subcontract pretty well from the same contracting pools. So it comes back to your security management being the important part of this process. Understand, though, as you're allocating the contractor, who's turning up, what training do they have, how are they going to be ensured to be retained throughout the event? They're really important questions to make sure that you've got the right security contractor allocated. Next, develop operating protocols, decision points, triggers, comms plans, show stop procedures. All of this stuff should be agreed weeks ahead of the show. Understand who can stop the show, what the processes are, what triggers will be involved with that, how those decisions will be communicated, and what restarts look like. Understand how they're going to respond to problems throughout the day at the event. What are their response protocols? And how do they report to police and other agencies within the event? All of this should be documented as part of the overall security management plan, and not just have some really vague words like "we will work closely with police to ensure the event remains safe." It should document exactly what the processes and protocols are for escalating any issues to police, how those handovers occur, and what documentation will be provided as part of that handover process, incident reports and the like. Brief and deploy. We're at the event. Make sure that every role at the event, every security guard is properly briefed for every position they are part of. So, as I said before, if you're moving somebody from a bag check to a crowd management or to a different asset control position, you need to rebrief them as part of that redeployment process. You can't brief them at the start of the day and say, well, at 2 p.m. we're going to come and get you and move, and this will be your new brief, because they'll forget that, right? They have to be rebriefed as part of that redeployment process. Again, it needs to be documented. It needs to be part of the security operating plan. Monitor and respond. Next, you are going to run the event, and you will probably be involved with a control room or some sort of control organisation process. Are the comms working? What are you going to do if the comms don't work? How is the control room set up? How will the security respond to the processes and protocols that they've got involved? You want to make sure that your security team isn't firefighting, that they're on top of everything that comes up. And if they start looking stressed and firefighting, well, what other procedures have you got to put in place to make sure they're not? This is where all of this work you've done beforehand will now get put into practice. So if you've skipped any of these parts of the process, you're going to find number 11 really, really tough. You're going to have a tough day at the office. So my advice is steps 1 to 10 make step 11, the event day, easy breezy, as people would say. And finally, debrief and document. This loops back to number 1 as review event history. So if you don't debrief properly and you don't document, you don't learn. And if you don't learn, you can't do it better next time. So you're just starting again from scratch. So it's not a chat in a car park. It's not a phone call. Oh, how'd you go on the weekend, mate? It's a proper debrief with a proper structure, and including all of the people involved with the security process. Don't just pick the security manager or the security contractor and have a one-on-one with them. Include everyone. Include the control room supervisors. Include the police. Include the key supervisors as part of that process, and get all of their input as part of that debrief. And that's how you're going to learn. And if it was me, I'd be putting all of that into AI and making sure that that matched up against all of our processes and protocols that we'd put in place. And I'd be learning for next time what had varied and how we can change our processes and protocols. I'm just going to touch on a couple of things now that I think are very important. A lot of events right around the world work on security ratios. So municipalities will say, well, if you're going to sell alcohol, you need to have one security guard for every 100 or 150 patrons, whatever it might be like. This is really bad. really lazy planning, because a lot of people go, okay, well, 1:100, I've got 5,000 people, means I need 50 security guards. Job done, tick. We get back to that box ticking exercise we talked about at the start. This ignores everything as part of that planning framework we just went through. A 5,000 person event on a flat open park for a family event has a completely different risk profile to a 5,000 person music festival on a waterfront site which runs from 2 p.m. till 2 a.m. There are a lot of different risks, and if you just work on ratios and think that the municipality or the person that insisted on the ratio knows better than you, you're absolutely wrong. It's your event, and you really need to work through that whole planning framework and process. Now, you might get to the point where you end up back at the ratio and go, oh, hey, 50 people, it worked. But you've undertaken your own process and your own planning, and that's why I think ratios they're a guide, they're a minimum. Don't skip out on the planning. And next, I'll call this the Bondi effect because we're in Australia. But this is something that happened recently in Australia. There was a terrorism attack at Bondi Beach just before Christmas. And the next thing that happens is a whole heap of events, municipalities and people say, okay, well, we need to implement all of this stuff for our event to make sure it's safe. They're reacting to a situation that had absolutely no bearing on them, and they have not done any risk assessments or any process to ensure that what they're putting in place is actually the correct mitigations for their event. So you can put as much concrete barriers, CCTV, hostile vehicle mitigation, all of these different mitigators in place, but they're not driven by the risk profile of your event. You do a proper risk assessment with somebody that understands that space, and they will give you an entirely different setup to what you might have thought is right. So don't have just a knee-jerk reaction to world events. Make sure that you're still planning properly. Now, again, you might end up back to saying, okay, well, the things I had a gut feeling of were right in the first place, but you've undertaken a process and you've got the paperwork to back it up. So if your security plan can't answer who decides what and when, I don't believe it's a plan. And it's pretty easy to put that in place. You're designing for threat, access, authority, and communication. If you get those right, you'll get the right numbers of guards in the right place, and everything else will fall into place around them. So good luck. Thanks, Melinda.